What's up, guys? In this video, I'd like to discuss how underrated the studies of brainwaves are, as well as the studies of biowaves. In specific sciences, more specifically neurosciences, why that it's important now more than ever for us to pay attention and deepen those studies so that we understand our brainwaves at a much deeper level, much more than they are studied today, and how that could potentially help shape the future design and development of AGI and ASI, which are the future of AIs, which are basically the future of the interaction between machines and humans. In today's education, when it comes to understanding the human brain, your typical textbook is primarily, I should say 99 point whatever percent, based off of what we know from the physical brain. If you've ever taken psychology classes or cognitive psychology or neuroscience classes, or if you haven't taken those but you're interested in them, any textbook that you pick up essentially is about dissecting the brain, looking at it, giving names to different parts of the brain, and looking at those studies the way in which we have studied the brain, which has been more or less about poking the brain or poking the person in question, and then seeing how the brain reacts, and then coming up with a model of it. Now, there is nothing wrong with that. In fact, every time you want to understand something, you start with its physical properties. And in this case, the physical brain would be different lobes: occipital lobe, frontal lobe, prefrontal lobe, you name it, the limbic system and hippocampus, etc. So you give names to all that. Another big portion of these textbooks are the chemistry of the brain, more specifically neurotransmitters, let's say like dopamine and etc. And those also, the majority of the volume of these textbooks is about those physical reactions that the brain basically elicits, and it goes into different parts of the human body, and they create different reactions. Again, we poke people, we measure it, and then we come up with a model around it. Another portion of this textbook is to look at how the neurons work. For example, we call them action potential, when different chemicals within the neurons increase or decrease, and that is how an electrical impulse is being elicited by a neuron, and then how they communicate. Basically, they either are turned off or turned on. Again, we poke the brain, the physical brain, we look at what it does, and then we observe it, and after numerous type of studies, we collect data, and then we come up with our understanding as to how we think the brain functions. Now, these are all great. These are all groundwork for us trying to understand ourselves, us trying to understand our physical body. However, anytime anybody in the field of neuroscience want to tell you that they know exactly how their brain works, nobody actually knows exactly how the brain works. For example, the topic of memory, you still don't know what the heck memory is, where it's stored. We have a lot of theories, but we still don't know. And here's why I want to get into the topic of the brain waves, brain frequencies, because every single electrical impulse, every single thought creates an electrical impulse, and every single electrical impulse creates a waves, a frequency, and that is basically what we have in the air. And if you think about it, all the communication, interaction between us to understand each other, communicate with each other, see each other, hear each other, and all that, it all goes through those brain waves or cellular waves, because we are not connected with a wire with each other. It's all wirelessly. Yet when you look at these textbooks, when it comes to the studies of the brain waves, you notice that only a very, very small fraction of the information that they're conveying or we know about brainwaves is essentially the way in which we've categorized them based on the frequency level of them. We've given them names, for example, theta, alpha, beta, gamma, and then we have also collected data in terms of thinking, okay, if a person has their eyes closed and they are kind of in a very smooth and calm mode and meditating, then we call it alpha waves because the frequencies are at a specific level. That's basically all that we have, all the information we have and we know about brainwaves. However, as I mentioned earlier, the way in which we actually exchange information, not only among ourselves, but also with our surroundings, is actually through waves. How else would the information, however you want to define it, by the way, would travel to you? How else would you see me right now? You are not connected to me with a wire. Basically, the waves of the whatever it's on the screen goes through your eyes, and the waves of whatever you hear goes in through your ears, and those are translated into information. So if you think about it, it's huge. Everything is through these waves. However, the studies that we have today in the body of knowledge of cognitive sciences when it comes to brain waves and biowaves is extremely limited. Essentially, what I'm trying to say is that when it comes to the brain interacting and eliciting specific reaction within itself, that is when you have the studies of the physical brain, such as neurotransmitters, what it does to all different cells, where, for example, within the brain, you have increased oxygen and glucose level, etc. But that's about it. So that is just the communication within the brain itself. But when it comes to the communication, for example, between you and I, in this case, you are listening to this video, that is where you have a huge field of untapped knowledge that we have as how this communication is even possible, because the information that right now is moving towards you is going through the video screen that you have in front of you. And so again, it's a miracle that there are no wires between us for the information to flow. It's all through the air and through the frequencies. And if you think about this type of vast amount of information that is being exchanged on a momentarily basis all around the world through the brainwaves and through the biowaves, yet we know so little about it, then it begs the question, why do we know so little about it, and why aren't we paying so much attention to it? One reason is that we don't see it. As humans, we tend to want to discuss, talk about, or even observe anything that is visible. If it's not visible for us, we basically don't pay attention to it. And brainwaves is one of them, for example. It's not visible to us. So that's one of the reasons that in sciences, you see much more studies about the physical brain itself as opposed to the waves, if that makes sense. And one of my longest ever passion was and still is the studies of the brainwaves, because I always wonder, first of all, what is information? How do we define information? And how does that travel among us? And how does that even translate within us? Again, the communication, for example, that I'm having right now to this screen. And so it's very important that we start paying much more attention to the current body of knowledge when it comes to brainwaves. Now, we do have a lot of scientists and obviously people who have been doing research, but if you look at the volume and the knowledge of it, of what we know today, and compare it to what we know about the physical brain, it's really, really nothing. And so we have ways to go when it comes to that. Okay, now lastly, why is that important? The reason it's important is because the wearables and perhaps the implantables or the tattoos, temporary tattoos that are being designed are getting much more sophisticated. So they are implanting sensors in the wearables as well as these temporary tattoos that can read the brainwaves. Now, if you don't know enough about the brainwaves, while you have wearables that could read it, what do we actually do with it? There are more and more startups now that are coming out and they are able to read the brainwaves, and that is basically a residual of all the past 2 decades of the BCI discipline, brain computer interfaces discipline. So I'm really happy to see them becoming more mainstream. But when it comes to understanding them, we still need a lot more studies and information. So if there's any one of you out there who's interested in these studies, I highly suggest you focusing much more on the wave, on the invisible brain, as opposed to the visible brain, because we do lack a lot of knowledge there. And that becomes important not only because the wearables and the implantables and the tatooables are getting more sophisticated, but also because in the future of design of machines such as AGI and ASI, it's inevitable that we will connect the human brain waves with the machines. It's inevitable. It's coming, and because of that, we need to know much more about the science of brain waves than we know today. And we also need to help it be less underrated when it comes to understanding it, if you compare it to, for example, the studies that we have about the visible brain. And so if you're interested in cognitive sciences, that is a very exciting field to be in. And a huge portion of my research is about that as well, if not all of it, about just the brain waves of it. Not because it's cool, but just because I myself am genuinely interested. And also I did notice, and I've noticed it for years, that how underrated it is. And every time you open a textbook, it's all about just the physical brain. I will go more in depth about these topics in the future, and also what the brain waves mean. For now, I hope you found it useful. Let me know if you have any questions.